Can we have the presentation from the on assets with guardrail group? I think you and Dean, can I have you at the... Can we have the OMG at the table? So I think you're missing Dean.
I'll get Dean.
So the OMG group.
Okay, I've been asked just while the OAG group's getting together to highlight the slides on ICP 15 and 16. I hope you're all well advanced in putting your comments together, given that they're due at the end of this month. The other thing that we'd like to highlight is that there are questions in the questionnaire about the linkage or potential linkages between ICS and ICPs 15 and 16. So for those who have been raising, that we should do some things in a qualitative way, there's your opportunity to give us some input.
We got slides?
Okay.
We got any slides?
But yeah, bear in mind that one stay fixed, that microphone. That one you need to press it to speak.
Are you going to do it? Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Firstly, Paolo and the IAIS, thanks very much for the opportunity for us to speak as the OAG group. Firstly, we'll say Marty Hanson from AIG very much wanted to be here, but was a casualty of the weather. So myself and Dean are going to be the poor substitutes today. But as I say, we're speaking on behalf of the 7 companies that have been very actively involved in the OAG development, and we very much appreciate the dialogue we continue to have with the IAIS team. We're at a very important juncture from our perspective. So following the Kuala Lumpur Agreement and the move to version 2, we have a very short window of opportunity to basically look at these the key elements of the ICS. But clearly, from our perspective on OAG, we think the discount rate is one of the critical points. I think Paolo made the point that, and we recognise that we have a market-adjusted valuation basis, but clearly one of the most important elements, well, what is the nature of that market adjustment? What should it be? So from our perspective, the key message that we wanted to give was that we have an opportunity in 2018 and to an extent 2019, before we lock down on version 2, to really explore this. And we really think it's essential to do that to its full extent. What we must do is we must use the opportunity to look at those options. And so from our perspective in the OAG, we think it's essential that continues to be a key part of the options that are tested. So we don't want the options narrowed down. Dean will mention in a moment, but we heard certain messages. We heard it from Insurance Europe and others about some of the complexities about OAG. We've obviously been liaising with a group of other companies quite widely, and what we have done is we've move towards an OAG version 2 that seeks to address some of those operational complexities, because we know from the Basel feedback that there are a number of companies who would have applied OAG, and a lot of companies did, particularly life companies, but found it quite difficult to do so in practice. So what we're moving between version 1 and version 2 is to address some of those complexities, make it more easy to apply and to apply it consistently, and also look at some of those placeholders. The other key message that was shared more widely with the IAIS, and particularly with yourselves and also with the executive and Vicky and others, is we've got a growing broader constituency who feel similarly of the same mind, that it is essential that we test OAG as part of the 2018 field testing. So 20 companies wrote an open letter to reinforce that. We know have subsequently spoken to a number of companies who similarly said they would have joined that letter, but to be blunt, it was just before Christmas and we wanted to get a letter to you, so we didn't basically speak to everyone, but we know that that's a wider constituency than just the 20. And really the key point of that letter, for those who haven't seen it, was, look, we've gone through a process of 6 options in 2016, 2017 did 3 options, and then in 2018 we're really saying that we want to have OAG and in its version 2 form tested alongside anything that you may choose to do yourselves, because we think it's essential. I think there was a lot of commonality in those messages that you came from the other stakeholders that we heard in the session before coffee about the need not to narrow down options. I think from our perspective we think it's an opportunity to look and compare and contrast the development of OAG and also the other discounting options that you've been looking at. And that was the key message that we wanted to reiterate. And so we also wanted to take the opportunity to speak to some of the developments we're looking at that Dean will do. The final thing I'll just say, obviously, with the 20 companies, you have predominantly of those life volunteers, of the predominant life companies, a majority of those that feel the same. So we just reiterate that from our perspective. But we'll go on to expand a little bit more in relation to how we ourselves are looking to, or have looked to refine OAG in its substance being kept the same, but basically simplified in a way that it can have a broader and more consistent application from those that are field testing.
No, that's fine. I think I'll keep my finger on the button. So yeah, I'm not going to go through the merits of the OAG again. I think Paolo would be quite pleased with that. You've heard it many times. I will make a few quick comments, just adding to some of the comments that were made in the earlier presentations. I found the presentation from Insurance Europe on Solvency II. I know there's a lot of Solvency II focus in there, but it does highlight what can go wrong if you don't have an appropriate discount rate method, if you don't have the linkage between the assets and the liabilities. Clearly, there are issues with Solvency II in terms of long-term business, and Helena also spoke to that as well. Just one comment, which is often so I'm sort of confused by it as well, and I've heard this from you several times, Paolo. You mentioned in response to Helena's comments around the MAV stress test scenario sort of giving non-intuitive results in terms of a lower capital requirement, or higher capital resources, I guess it's similar thing, but that stress test was a shock to spreads. It was just shocking spreads, that's all it was. So for those companies where the liabilities are much longer than the assets, then what happens is the present value of those liabilities goes down by more than the present value of the assets. To me, that is the correct result. I think the issue on that stress test is it's incomplete. Because clearly if you have an increase in spreads, you would also have an increase in defaults. And defaults weren't part of that stress test. So it's a very artificial stress test, and I think it's given an artificial result. So I wouldn't point to that as being an example of where MAV doesn't seem to work. It's just, I want to clear out that point of confusion. So let's just turn to OAG 2.0. And I won't go through every point in this slide, but this is just to summarize what the working group have been doing since December, when the field test results were disseminated. And And the key is we're building on 1.0. That's the nature of a field test. You learn information, you use that information, and you move forward. And that's what we've been doing with 2.0. So the first point, and it's come up a few times actually, 1.0, it was certainly data intensive. It was complicated in places. The specification was a bit too exact with hindsight, so we were calculating asset liabilities at every single duration. And they created a lot of noise on that, and many volunteers observed some very spiky sort of discount rates. So in 2.0, we're still sticking to that same theme. It's still the asset liability ratio as a measure of how matched you are, but that ratio is being calculated more on a lifetime basis. So it's a single calculation. We're going to be using publicly available data because, our fixed income assets has got the yields out there, so why not use that data that's available? So it's still sticking to the same principle, but it's a definite simplification of what we were doing in 1.0. And then the other items that have been worked on are really to address a number of placeholders that were in the 2017 field test. So there are a number of assumptions or processes that were in what we did for 2017, which quite frankly were just to get it into the field test for 2017, but they weren't our long-term expectations of how this would shape up going forward. So for example, there was a 10 basis points long-term spread over risk-free. Clearly 10 basis points it's way too low, and what we're doing under 2.0 and we would expect to happen under the other methods is there should be some sort of reference to long-term historical spreads over risk-free. So that 10 basis points should change. In 1.0, we had a very simple linear grade to a spot rate. Nice and simple, but with hindsight, too simple. So we're going to align that with the other grading methods that are being used, the Smith-Wilson, and in particular, it will be grading to a forward rate. So that will bring the OAG into sync with this long-term rate being a forward rate. Number 4 there is important, and it's definitely been referenced a few times today in terms of appropriate recognition of equity sale cash flows. So for long-term business, it is quite appropriate to back those assets with equity assets or alternative long-duration assets. It's a reality of how we conduct our ALM for long-term business, and we need to reflect that reality in the discount rate that we calculate. For OAG 1.0, we had a very punitive assumption, just to keep it simple, which was to ignore all the equity sales. And what we're doing under 2.0 is just putting some methodology in place where we can recognize those equity sales subject to appropriate guardrails. And we always come back to appropriate guardrails when we look at equity. But an inappropriate guardrail is to ignore them, right? Because that's just not reality. So they will be in 2.0, and they will be in there in a way that is quite transparent and has got those guardrails attached to them. And then the last item is just recognizing that it's appropriate to use internal ratings where we've got appropriate guardrails on those internal ratings.
What do you mean by appropriate guardrails? I mean, one of the questions we all, from a supervisory perspective, is always coming out in our discussion is you're doing lots of work, and all this work needs to make the results a bit more generous. But we don't see much work done on the guardrails, and I mean, one of the recurrent theme on the supervisory community is the G is becoming lowercase from dusk to dawn.
I'll make a couple of observations. Our view would be the refinements we're making is not to make it higher, it's to make it more economic, which would link strongly back to what Olav and others were saying earlier, that what we want is something that reflects asset liability management and reflects the basis on which we're managing our business to reflect the underlying economics. For example, ignoring equities isn't a guardrail. Similarly, internal ratings across geographic areas is absolutely key, where there isn't readily available access. But on each one of those, we have talked about the guardrails. I think it links in well with the discussions you're having yourselves on ICP 15. I think that, and we need to link those two on the wider aspects of those, because you have an overall framework of principles by which you should conduct ALM. That is the most effective guardrail that exists from the internal management side. Each one of those, whether it's, for example, internal rating use, would be subject to regulatory approval. When we've talked about, a lot of these areas individually, we've identified guardrails. We think we've made quite conservative assumptions on a number of these ones. So it's that balance between guardrails, which you call big G, little g, and what we would say a basis is economic. So we think we can get through that. I think the other thing to remember is that the ICS is at a group level going to only apply to the IAGs, which is basically 50-odd companies. We think that with close cooperation between the companies and the supervisors, it is very manageable to make certain the guardrails are in a place, because you would expect companies to be managing ALM effectively. To us, the most important thing about OAG is it's the closest reflection to how we're managing our business. So you're not creating anything artificial on the basis in which we're looking at it. So we think it actually becomes a more realistic outcome, and it's one that's close to how we're managing the business. So we had not sought to increase OAG. We've just sought to make it economic, and we're comfortable that we can look at those guardrails. And as you know, Paolo, we continue to engage with that where we find those appropriate on an individual basis.
Yeah, I'm also confused by the comment that we are increasing or decreasing the valuation. I mean, if you look at the items up there, the first item is simplifying. The second item is, again, simplifying, just making sure it's a forward rate. We're consistent with the rest of ICS. The third item is clearly the 10 basis points was a placeholder. So that will decrease the valuation, but as Hugh just said, that's really economic reality. Number 4 is the one that is quite emotive with the regulators in terms of that's where the perception of being aggressive comes into the mix, and we actually haven't shared with you yet the equity proposal we have on equities. So you haven't seen what we've got on equities and the guardrails attached to it. And then item 5, as Hugh just said, is economic anyway. So we're definitely not looking to decrease the valuation. What we are looking to do is improve OAG 2.0 so it moves more in sync with the liabilities. So the assets and the liabilities move more in sync. That is the fundamental requirement of a good discount rate method, not having an arbitrary low or arbitrary high base valuation.
So in the slides we'll make available, we've gone a little bit more detail. As you know, we've worked through this we're very close on technical specs to share these with this. I mean, just to reiterate a few key messages that, as you know, we've always believed that the OAG group has sought to engage you constructively, but if you look at the range of companies, the geographical spread has always been deliberately very diverse. You need an ICS that basically works across markets, across the world, whether it's Asia, the US, or Europe. And we very much sought to do that. And I think it's interesting to note that the expansion of the call to maintain OAG and distinctly test it has been joined by another 13 range of companies. And similarly, if you looked at the range of diversity, that's not coming from a single jurisdiction. It's coming from whether it's China, Asia, Japan, North America, or within Europe as well. So we think that there's a strong momentum to do this because we fundamentally think it is a good basis to address both the economics and the volatility, and a good basis for the adjustment that we believe is going to be more in line with how fundamentally the insurance business is being developed and is being run. So, Charlotte, in summary, we believe strongly that really 2018 is going to give us our last real tangible opportunity to test in a really strong way the various options that you're looking at within version 2. So we would see, well, why wouldn't you look to test OAG in its more refined form? obviously you have to reserve the right to test what you want to in terms of revised blended or whatever, but for us we think that looking to expand and to refine and develop more data from OAG can only be of benefit to both yourselves and also ourselves in terms of gathering that wider pool of information, because ultimately we need an ICS that works to reflect the economics of our business, that has global application. So ducking things like internal ratings in Asia or equities or in Canada doesn't make sense. We think it's very sensible to address those, but in a controlled way with guardrails. So we just reiterate what we said before, that we stand here willing to help and support in whatever way we can. I think the fact that we've leveraged now beyond the 7 to a wider group of companies to be engaged on that should also give you comfort that as we engage more broadly with those wider group of companies, which is what we intend to do, that we will help refine the technical specs to probably get a greater level of consistency. I think the one thing that you want is more detail and more data for which to make your decisions and to drive the direction of version 2. So therefore we think OAG gives you that additional information, but you should draw comfort from the fact that as we expand the tech specs and work together with other companies, you should get a greater level of consistency in the way in that OAG is being applied, so it helps you to basically understand the data, because I think part of the problem that you had, and we know from Basel, was the data, the way in form you've got the data last year, and its diversity made it quite difficult for you to pull things out. And so I think, we think that will very much help the IAS in its development, as well as giving comfort to companies that the constructive work that we've been doing is being recognised in terms of the options being tested. So welcome for any more questions or any other comments from anybody else.
Maybe you
Hi.
just...
It's Bill Schweiger with Aegon. First of all, I appreciate the efforts that have gone into putting together the OAG proposal. We supported this proposal in our response to the field testing questionnaire last year. We would support including it in 2018 field testing. And sort of going back to the presentation that was made before the coffee break, back a few years ago at an IAIS meeting, we said that Solvency II should be informative but not determinative of the direction of the ICS. And what I think we've seen over 3 years is that the ICS very closely resembles Solvency II, even though Solvency II is still a very new framework. It hasn't really undergone a real severe market stress. We don't know how companies would respond to the volatility, or even in a lot of ways how much volatility would exist. But we do know, and I was reading on the plane coming down an analyst report basically saying that European companies en masse are getting out of the business of offering products where they're long-term guarantees in effect, where they're assuming market risk. Now the market risk still exists, it's just being kept by consumers, individual consumers, rather than insurers who can hedge it and manage it collectively. So what I would encourage is thinking about the fact that all of this stuff really matters. It matters on how companies react because it creates incentives. It also matters in terms of the products that consumers around the globe will be able to buy. And so we consider that very important, and we would therefore encourage not to kind of rush to conclusions that may be in the long run questionable. Thank you.
Not that I'm keeping score. That make me 21 companies, pal. On the basis that Aegon is an example of a company that didn't sign.
Okay. Mark?
Thank you very much, Chairman and others. So, as you may be aware, I'm not a part of OAG working group, so please consider my words as the independent advice, and I think OAG is a good idea. So then I think that for long-term business, so based on, not, for example, especially in my view, the risk-free rate is based on where you are, but OAG is rather based on which direction you are likely to be going. And I think it's more relevant for long-term business to foresee the future rather than looking at the present. And then especially you talk about guardrail things, and then I can't talk about formula because I'm not an actuary, I'm rather a philosopher. So, and then in 2 weeks I'm going to Tokyo and welcome students from different countries and give a lecture on global communication and business. And for example, how the language and culture affect on the business-making decision-making process or communication, including what we can learn from ancient Chinese philosopher applicable in modern business. It has nothing to do with insurance. So in Tao it says that the world consists of the balance of yin and yang, and everything is cyclical. You have a good time, bad time. You have to be a part of nature for the whole process. So we should assume that long-term business has a good time and a bad time. So looking back to the 1980s, we have a bubble economy at that time. At that time, I was very concerned with the market consistent variation because interest rate may go down in the future. So, and just focusing on the risk-free rate is just looking at the high interest rate at that time, it was not a good idea. So I think this whole philosophy of the regulatory requirements should encourage the companies to be encouraged in a bad time and cautious in good time. And this is how you should design the system. So I had a very interesting conversation with Roman, the Deputy Secretary General, in the lobby of this city. So I'd like to share that conversation. Tomorrow morning, I'm flying back to New York very early because I have an appointment with my hairstylist in New York. And Roman asked me, well, they're going to cut your hair or add your hair? And my response, that was a very good question. In the bubble economy at that time, and the market was very good, so and then my hair was like this in the early 20s. I needed to have a lot of haircut to look conservative. But now I'm going to ask a question. So in the poor economy, are you going to keep the same haircut system as a regulatory scheme, or you should add your hair? That concludes my remark. Thank you very much.
Just to let you know that Peter was looking for a hairstylist here in Nashville, and he went with a taxi all around town, and he couldn't find one, so he decided he came back here. And I was hoping because I needed a haircut too.
Okay, thank you.
But I have one final question because we need to move down to the IAA and then to the ABA, just for you in terms of, last year, when we analyzed, the results from last year told us effectively that even if firms were allowed to use, for the OAG option, even if firms were allowed to use the OAG option, effectively, in some cases, for most of their portfolio, they resorted to HQA. So effectively, this, from our perspective, reinforced the fact that actually you don't treat all liabilities the same way. You differentiate between different type of liabilities, and you need more tailored approach for certain type of liabilities with respect to others. What work are you doing this year with respect to this issue, and how are you going to frame this issue this year?
Well, some of the approach taken last year was a function of the complexity. It was this technical spec last year. With hindsight, was very data intensive. You had to collect a lot of data, a lot of year by year asset cash flow data to do the OAG as specified last year. So it was a lot of work to do that calculation, and for certain lines of business, and it comes back to the use of approximations or whatever, proportionality, that's the word I'm looking for. You'd weigh up the amount of work involved in that calculation relative to the benefit it would or the results it would show for particular lines of business. So PAR would be a good example. For power business, you could do all this work and update the yield curve, and then having got that new yield curve, you come along and update the dividends, and guess what? Once you've updated the dividends, you probably got back to a not dissimilar result, a valuation result from where you first started. So, a lot of companies, I'll speak to Manulife, we did the same. I mean, there were certain blocks of business where you would look at it and go, yeah, it's going to be too much work relative to the expected outcome. So that's the first point that we put on the slide there in terms of simplifying the approach, making it less data intensive. That's key to addressing what you've just highlighted. So once it becomes simple and it's less data intensive, it becomes more natural and more easy to do the OAG, and then you won't have to make these proportionality type assumptions. So quite reasonably, we would expect that once it's simple to use, the data requirements are easier, then it would naturally be applied to more blocks of business.
For my mind, Paolo, that will be one of the important reasons to continue to test OAG is, as you say, it's difficult to tell, is that a function of how you're ALMing, or is it a function of the complexity? Now, we know for certain, we have had certain, we heard in Basel some companies would have applied OAG more broadly, but they didn't because of the complexity. So I think one of the iterations that we'll have if we test in version in 2018 is that with a simplified basis, are we going to get the same cut? Are we going to find that companies actually can use it more broadly if it's complied more simply? And to me, that's exactly one of the type of elements of detail that we'll find out as we test it for 2018.
Thanks, Dean. We need really to move on. We've got Diana.
If I could make one quick comment, I'd like to thank Peter for his contribution to ICS. On a personal note, I'd really like to thank Peter for not giving Hugh and myself too much grief on Australia absolutely trouncing England in the Ashes. I was expecting that email from Peter, and it never arrived, so I appreciate that.
I've been busy with other things recently.
Yeah. Primarily being on planes recently. Yeah.
Diana?
Yes, just very quickly, Diana Keegan from MetLife. I just wanted to add our voice to our support for testing both the OAG and the blended option in 2018. I think it was clear that we did have some questions around the OAG, but it seems like the version 2.0 may have taken care of a substantial amount of those, and would like to sort of add virtually add our name to that letter. We were a casualty of the Christmas rush that Hugh mentioned earlier, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. I'll make that 22. Thanks, Peter, as well.
Thanks. Dave, please.
So the IAA is victim of travel. My colleague Stuart Wason had a ticket and hotel reserved to come in yesterday, and his flight was canceled coming out of Toronto, and flights are not available today. So, but I'm glad to be here, and I hope that what I have to contribute may help provide some ways to navigate some of the tension points that have been raised earlier today here. Let's see. So we have a group of people from Asia, Europe, and U.S. that are both former regulators and people who have worked in industry. So we get the same breadth of questions and diversity of views that are evident certainly within the IAS. So the first thing that we've kind of stepped back and said, we think that as we tried to think through, at the end of the day, we're going to come up with a number. And what is that number going to mean? It should be something that facilitates a supervisory college in order to oversee insurers. It certainly is going to provide an indicator of relative strength, but it should be something that also highlights how to use effective planning for any recovery or resolution issues that may arise. And I understand that recovery and resolution, in a sense, rests with the FSB, but at the same time, the college, in order to be able to understand what are the options that we have when things go south. That's the point of what this is trying to clarify. In doing that, we've realized one of the items that we discussed in December was this concept of risk and uncertainty, and that there are some risks that are very well known, fairly well quantified, and it's easy to use a statistical distribution, come up with a number that's fairly reliable. And then there's a continuum of things that become more and more uncertain. And the problem comes is how do you handle uncertainties of unknown distributions? we end up putting a number in as capital and Mochi to handle all the uncertainty. The reality is it's the most appropriately expressed as a range. And let's kind of understand that kind of conceptual distinction up front and realize that we actually see in the business world models evolve for products based on the degree of uncertainty that may exist in the product. So, for example, short-term insurance is sold on an annual renewable basis because of the uncertainty in the premiums in the next year. You can't predict more than a year ahead of time. And ironically then, future premiums are a source of margins. Most companies would say, that's our source. If we're going to need to raise capital next year because the market or the risk environment has changed, Mochi and capital are raised through additional premiums. Life insurers tend to raise capital, has to be internal on the balance sheet. So there are resources to address risk and uncertainty that may be on the balance sheet or may not be on the balance sheet. And so, for example, the discussions earlier today on valuing of long-term risks. Some long-term risks should not be sold. And long-term care, I think, is a great example of a risk that was greatly undervalued because there was a lot of uncertainty. But the framework that it was being sold in didn't have any lens to help understand. It was just treated like, oh, all risk is quantified, we can put a number down, and now we are blind to the fact that we actually have a lot of uncertainty here. But by the way, I just have a couple of points to make, so we'll get through this pretty quickly. So we think there's three things that would be important to kind of frame the discussion about Mochi going forward. One is that central estimates need to be part of a comprehensive set of financial statements that are certified by auditors, appointed actuaries, and other suitable persons. I know there's a lot of concern, well, how can I trust some of these numbers? Are they consistent? And the best tools we have are a formal process that takes a set of financial statements that are integrated, that are certified, and say, here's a reasonable representation. So let's, then the second part is that I think the interesting thing is that from a Mochi standpoint, we think that given that there are various financial frameworks in existence right now, or financial statements, that being able to understand what are the size of the margins that are embedded within them. So some use a central estimate plus a margin, very explicit. Others have a conservative assumption, has the margin buried within it. But each of those frameworks does have the ability to get to a central estimate. So GAAP and US Stat, Canadian, Australian, all have central estimates that are available and could be, particularly as an IAIG is going to have the priority of understanding its margins. It's trying to manage capital, so it's going to have a fairly good view. So that information is available. And so we think that if you're going to accept that there's always going to be some uncertainty about a central estimate, but we're going to have to accept the best shot we have is through an audited set of statements, then Mochi, we actually have the ability to get some understanding of what those margins are. And that leads us to then the next question of how do you tell what kind of credit should be given? Is Mochi, should it be given credit for capital, or should it be seen as not part of capital? So this idea that by using a combination of either stress or cash flow testing, that financial statements are going to have unique shortcomings. So Solvency II, we've heard about, heightens a procyclicality. Any market value approach is going to heighten a procyclicality. So the stressing of that balance sheet is a different kind of test than you need for a statutory or GAAP that may be weak on guarantees and options. And so you want to be thinking through what's the framework that's here. Then you can assess what are the vulnerabilities then within that IAG and facilitate recovery and resolution opportunities. For example, at the end of the day, you are not going to sell a whole IAG to another IAG. So whatever margin is there supposedly to attract an investor, it's not that element. It's really how do the different pieces work in there. So a margin for a short-term insurance is not the same as a margin for a long-tail risk. And those numbers get collapsed into a single number. So we want to be able to kind of find a way to get to the depth of that. It also then allows you to get access to the overall calibration that you might be needing over the next 5 years and afterwards as well. We think this will be a key way to help address and provide some background for the whole question of equivalence. And we're saying, well, how do I determine what is equivalent. We think this would be a key way to help provide a way to assess that. So here's a radical idea, just to kind of stimulate the thinking. One approach would be to say, what if you identified the first level of supervisory intervention and said there's no credit given for mochi at all? And the trigger that's then happens when you hit that first trigger is, oh, you must disclose your margins and have a discussion with the regulator about the margins. And you kind of go into it, and it requires an in-depth analysis. If a company is sufficiently capitalized, it is in no danger of hitting that trigger, the margins are in a sense irrelevant from a supervisory standpoint. The margins become important as some first initial trigger so that you can start to understand how do we work with the company. I think, so the reality is that the margins, whether there's one sense universal margin, if it's dictated by formula, we recognize it's not going to really give us the real answer. To the extent that we allow professional judgment and rely on that, there's going to be some variation. And so the important point is to make sure that you're relying on some kind of professional documentation that's clarifying whether there's greater or lesser conservatism. And it won't be company-specific, it'll be risk-specific. Different risks will have different ways in which the margins will be addressed. I think, and by the way, what we've shared here is just the high-level points. We've probably got about a dozen pages of write-up behind this, kind of giving more detail and more clarification, which we hope to submit here in the next couple of weeks. One is just a written summary behind these recommendations. The second is just stepping back and saying, we've identified there's a C mochi and a P mochi, and here's various balance sheets that have all been discussed today, or well, some of them even haven't been discussed today, but are in current existence. And just kind of walking through how does a mochi operate in those, and if I were a supervisory college, when you understand what's happening within a jurisdiction, how do those margins operate? And I think that's all I've got.
Thanks, Dave. Ralph?
Yeah. Ralph Blanchard, Travelers. Dave and I have already had some discussion, so he probably knows some of what I'm going to say. One of which is that mochi by itself, you can't test. I can look at an estimate of the nominal value, and I can see, well, gee, what happened? On discount, I can actually say, well, what payment pattern did you assume? And I can look at what happened. And then yield curve on the property casualty non-life side, that's far less an issue on the life side. So that's not as big a deal. But on the mochi, I have really no way of saying, well, that's the right number. A classic example, Sandy, was that a 1 in 50? Was it a 1 in 100? Was it a 1 in 200? I can probably find well-respected academics who could argue any number I come up with because we don't really know, and you can't back test it. So the danger with a mochi is that if you're going to have a formulaic one, it doesn't tell you anything about the risk. If you instead rely on the company to come up with its estimate, historically, over the years, over the decades in the business, I've noticed that the people who tend to be the most risky tend to always view themselves as the least risky. So if you ask them to come up with their own number of the mochi, it's probably going to be an inverse correlation with regard to whether there's actually risk there. I don't think mochi is going to be a useful metric on the non-life side. I can't argue for the life side, but on the non-life side, because it can't be actually verified, you can't back test it, and there's so much judgment involved that there's a lot of agency risk or management risk. I'm just skeptical. I'm less skeptical in the discount, but I don't think the mochi should really be used as a determinant for anything with regard to an action level. So that's my view on the mochi part, and I wouldn't use it again as a deterministic of whether someone should actually file a plan or anything or any of the action level items.
If I could respond first to Ralph on that. One of the elements that we didn't cover here, but we've discussed and walked through but it highlights the idea of why the central estimate is important to be relied upon. Most frameworks use an actual to expected analysis of runoff to set capital requirements for those estimates that are uncertain. And so there are tools and frameworks that allow you to, in a sense, start to understand what's the extent of variability I can anticipate. Now, whether you draw the line, so in Australia, they would argue we set a conservative line as an arbitrary mochi in the sand, if you will, and then they have a capital line.
Yeah.
You may argue you just need the capital line for that short-term business. But the actual to expected analysis of current assumptions, even the life side, is another aspect of how you need to think about the idea of margins and assessing them.
And about 5 years ago, looking at Australia, because Australia was the farthest along on this, I actually looked at their triangles of their runoff of their unbiased central estimate, and I found that most companies had a very biased estimate. Central estimate. And so I was kind of skeptical about what information the mochi was adding if you couldn't even get the central estimate right. Someone told me that because of the market being tight, people had an incentive to actually put more money away to hide it from the tax man, etc. So just treat mochi with a large grain of salt.
Well, it's certainly a function of the uncertainty within the central estimate. The more you're uncertain with the central estimate, obviously the more uncertain everything else is as well. And again, that's why that idea about understanding not all risk can be quantified and captured in a single number that goes across both short-term and long-term, financial, non-financial, and risk that's well calibrated and risk that may be more uncertain. So yeah, I fully agree. It's trying to understand when is the skepticism appropriate, but there's lots of useful and disciplined information that is available within the financials as well that we need to make sure we're capturing.
Thank you, Dave. I think this, because we are biting on time on the ABA stakeholders meeting, so this concludes the first part of the stakeholders. So don't go away. Just Alberto's coming here, and we continue straight away. Otherwise, we're gonna keep you here until 8 o'clock. Thank you and thank you again for all your comments and feedback. Thanks. Tenelo schiacciato,
So now you can relax because we will not speak about ICS. Yeah, while Bernard is setting up the presentation, just wanted to introduce ourselves. I'm Alberto Corinti from Italian Supervisory Authority. I'm coordinating together with Stephen Seitz from FIO US, the task force dealing with a number of issues related to the risk margin in the insurance sector. I have with me Catherine Leson and Bernard, who are providing the support, remarkable support, I have to say, from the Secretariat on this difficult work stream. So we have been squeezed by the ICS, but we have been keen, in devoting at least a small part of this stakeholder meeting to ABA, because for us it's very important to get any early feedback on the consultation that has been issued before Christmas. I appreciate it's maybe too early to have final views from your side, and I have to say also the consultation paper in itself was not, didn't include a conclusive proposal that you could react in a definite way. So it was on purpose quite generic. Because this is a relatively new issue for the insurance sector, and instead of presenting something concrete at the end of 2018, we wanted to have a first interim consultation that could drive also a dialogue with you and make us even more aware of which are your concerns, what you think we should focus more, in order to take into account of all those aspects while developing our work. I don't know, Stephen, want to add something?
Maybe just very high level. I think, first off, we really appreciate that everyone made the effort to get here today. I know that someone traveling from D.C. this morning, it was very difficult. And, I think we just want to thank, Alberto and Jonathan and Vicky for making these opportunities available for everyone here in the U.S. I think this is a great opportunity. And I just want to echo, Alberto's comments on, we do have an open door policy with this group. And I know that Alberto and I are always willing to engage on the topic. And I think the work plan demonstrates that with the 2 sets of consultations. So I just would encourage you to, engage with any one of us.
Okay, how to organize in the best way this session? We had the occasion to explain what we were going to include in the consultation paper already in Kuala Lumpur. I gave also a presentation of the consultation paper during a call before Christmas. So now maybe we could be short in presenting the content of the consultation. We would like to give more time to a dialogue, if possible. In order, as I said, to get early feeling from your side on the direction we are taking in developing ABA measure. And as I said, for us it would be important to know whether we are going in the right direction or not, and which are the issues that you think we should be aware of. So we will have a short presentation of the consultation paper. Then we can have an interaction, possibly structured into 3 parts. First part dealing the general approach we are using for developing ABA. Second part on the identification of the activities that should be focused on in this exercise. And the third part on the what it comes after the identification of the activities, which is the gap analysis and the filling of the gaps. Any gaps with the development of any policy measure. I have to say, maybe at the beginning, this will not be the only possibility to have a dialogue. As I said, we are quite early in the consultation paper. Maybe you have not had the possibility to go deeper into the analysis of the issue. For this reason, we will have another stakeholders meeting in London. The date is the 1st of February in the afternoon. We will have half a day completely devoted to ABA without any ICS interference. So 1st of February, I'm aware, it's quite a short notice, but it was difficult to find the date and put together all the agenda. So 1st of February, we will have a stakeholder meetings, and as we have done for the ICS, we would encourage, association companies, whoever is interested, to present also their views, not very necessarily in a very structured, long way, but I think for us it would be useful to listen from you on the issues. So if we can go, Bernard, to the second slide. Those slides have been built actually on the slides that we prepare for the presentation in Kuala Lumpur. So there is not a lot new issues. In these slides, we listed all the aspects, all the works that IAIS has already done in the field of systemic risk in insurance. And we did that just to highlight on the fact that we are building on those work. We are now speaking about ABA, not anymore on the entity-based approach, but actually the concept, the approach, and all the analysis that have been done in these papers are relevant, and we will take them into account. On the following slides, we try to put this work stream into the context. You know that our task force has been mandated to develop the work, the overall approach of IAIS with regard to systemic risk in insurance. And there are three main work streams. One is developing activity-based approach. The other one is taking care of underside the inconsistencies between financial sectors. And the third one is reviewing, based on the regular triannual review period, the GSII assessment methodology to designate GSII. I think this is important because it highlights that we have now the possibility to have an holistic approach and to take into account all the policy measures and all the approach that as a package could become the measure to apply to mitigate the systemic risk in insurance. And also the sequence of this work stream is important because we will look at a revision of the entity-based approach when we will have made progress on the activity-based approach. As I said, the timeline for the final consultation, which will include the results of all three work streams, is expected at the end of 2018, and we have now consultation, which is just an interim consultation, doesn't include a conclusive proposal, but is there to get early impacts. The project is to be finalized then by 2019 and expected to be implemented 2020. Now, with regard to the content of the consultation paper, the consultation paper actually includes consideration on the ABA concept. To the next slide. To the ABA concept, to the approach that we, as a task force, are going to follow in order to develop any ABA measure, and just to give some key elements of the different steps of the approach. So, in terms of ABA concept, this is the definition included consultation paper. The approach to mitigate systemic risk through broadly applicable policy measure addressing potential systemically risky activity across institutions. Here, as I said in Kuala Lumpur, the key aspects are related to the fact that the policy measures have a broad application and not applied to identified companies, and also the fact that the policy measures are there to mitigate any effect, any externalities that companies could create as a multitude of companies, and not as a single company. The approach, the analysis includes all the type of activity, insurance, so insurance activities, so it's not, as in the case of NT&I, on only some part of the activity of the insurance company. And as far as possible, we are trying to follow an approach that based on economic analysis of the issues, trying to identify and explain which are the vulnerabilities, which are the possible impacts, and how the vulnerabilities could become an impact on the system. That is, which are the transmission channels. And we actually try to use also this approach for NT&I, even though with regard to the NT&I, we made reference to the entity-based approach. But again, the approach in the analysis is actually the same. In the following slides, actually, we summarize key differences between entity-based and activity-based approach. Personally, I think this is the best way to explain what is the activity-based approach. There is different terms of type of assessment, not the impact due to the failure of a single institution, as in the case of the entity-based approach, but rather the impact that the common behavior or common reaction of many companies could have on the system. So not impact upon failure, but correlated action that could create externalities. And again, a scope of application is not on single identified companies, but a wider range of companies. As we will say, one of the issues is which is this range of companies, all the companies or only some. This is something that we have to focus on. In the following slides, we summarize the steps that we are going to follow for developing the policy measure. I will not insist very much on that. The first step is the identification which are the activities. In this regard, in the paper, we speak about activities that could be potentially systemic, in the sense that could create impact on the system. Obviously, those aspects are not binary. We are conscious that there are not, you cannot divide in a black and white approach activities that are systemic and activities that are not systemic. It's not a binary approach. For this reason, we prefer not to refer to the legal form of the activities, but rather to the risk exposure stemming from those activities. Also, in this regard, it would be interesting to know what do you think about this approach. We think that this could help at least in taking into account which is the vulnerabilities considering the interaction between assets and liabilities of the balance sheet. Could also allow to take into account better any risk mitigating mechanism put in place by the companies, and also could avoid arbitrage due to the reference to classification by legal fashion. So risk exposure rather than legal form. On the step 2, when we have identified which are the activities, to see what do we have now in the IAIS toolkit to mitigate those type of exposure. And those policy measures that we could already exist could be designed for micro purposes, for reducing the probability of failure of a single institution, but could have an effect also in reducing the potential systemic impacts of those activities when I consider that in aggregate, across companies. So we will look at the IAIS policy measure. We will look also at any standard that the insurance companies should apply that are issued by other standard setter. The third step is to see whether there are gaps between if some risk is not sufficiently mitigated, and the fourth step is to define which are the policy measures that could cover those residual risk. When speaking about designing any policy measure, we have made clear in the consultation paper that we will be keen as far as possible to consider any risk mitigating mechanism put in place by the company itself, but all existing at jurisdictional level. And this step will be also obviously the most critical, because besides designing which are the any necessary additional policy measure or any enhancement of existing policy measure, we should also look at what would be the scope of application of those policy measures and which room we could give to the proportionality principle in applying those policy measures. So those are the issues that will really occupy us more in the following months. Few things with regard to the first step. As I said, we will focus on the exposure rather on the legal form. We have already highlighted that two main exposures that should be focused are liquidity risk and macroeconomic risk exposure, as they could actually create exposure that could be strongly correlated between companies and therefore could trigger correlated action or correlated impacts, by the action of the companies. But there could be also other things, because we ask, for example, in the consultation paper whether the issue of interconnectedness could have what should be the role in an ABA context of interconnectedness, of substitutability, for example. And then we wonder whether there could be other issues that should be taken into account. We make the example of operational risk, for example, whether operational risk could be an exposure that under certain circumstances could create, externalities. And this is the case also for other type of situation. We make the example of a search for yield in certain circumstances, or, for example, a generalized mispricing of certain risk. So this is an issue where we would welcome your view and even concern about those issues. On the step 2 and 3, as I said, we will look also at other standard sectors. So as far as possible, we'll consider whether the overall cross-sectoral toolkit is well equipped or not to cover those risks. And we obviously will take into account, as I said, of measures that are not necessarily macroeconomic measures, measures that are there also for micro purposes. In the consultation paper, and I will move to the fourth step, in the consultation paper we decided, even though our analysis is not finalized, we thought it was useful to give an idea of the type of policy measure we are thinking about, and we give some examples, but obviously those should not be considered as proposals. Those policy measures are intended to be integrated in the ICPs or in the ComFrame in different purposes, in different fashion. That could be measures to mitigate risk exposure, or could be more, specifically macro policy measure, like the policy measure which are currently included already in ICP 24. I would stop here. I have already said that this is not the only occasion to have a dialogue. We will meet 1st of February, and we'll encourage any presentation also from stakeholders. And now I don't know whether Stephen want to add something. I would open the discussion again, highlighting that we are aware you can also not have at this stage a position on the different aspects, but we don't have a lot of time in front of us. The end of 2018 will arrive soon. So as soon as you highlight your concern, the better. The earlier you highlight those, the better it is for us, because we have a meeting soon. We will stay here in Nashville for having a meeting of the task force on Wednesday and Thursday, and we could immediately take into account of those inputs. Sorry? Yeah.
No, and I do just want to echo one of Alberto's points. I think it's important that we're having the stakeholder session here and then in London, because I think traditionally our sector has maybe thought of the GSI policy measures as, affecting a finite set of firms. Maybe it's 9, a dozen, 10. But I think this project, as Alberto laid out, has the potential for broader applicability across the sector. So I'm very happy to see that we have a broad cross-range of firms here. And I think Alberto's point where he made on proportionality is also crucial to the conversation. So I would just keep those bigger picture concepts in mind when you're looking at the consultation paper initially.
Yeah, Joe.
Okay. Thank you, Alberto. And again, thank you for all the work you did to get here, because I know a lot of people had a hard time. And I guess most fundamentally, what I'd like to say, again, MetLife is still studying the proposal, but at least initially we can say we think, as you're talking about as a general approach, we want to thank you. We think it's a fundamentally much better approach to properly identify, measure potential systemic risk, as well as to identify what policy measures to take to address those. So we testified on this first, I think, in 2008. So we've been focused on activities for a long time, and so we're very grateful for you looking at this in that way. Another thing that we really like about the general approach is the 4 steps. I think it really does help make it practical in terms of addressing this in a realistic way. And I'll get some more points on that in a minute. But just in general, the idea of taking into account current microprudential rules, or even, as you said, best practices, I wouldn't necessarily say of firms, but of the industry, I think is a critically important part of it, and I'm glad that you're taking that into account. And then, again, a general approach, the scope, and you just, at the tail end of your comments, talked about, the broader applicability, but taking into account proportionality, and we think that's very important as well. So I think fundamentally it's a good approach. Probably the 2 areas where we have the most questions, we think further work would need to be done. First is in the area of, in the steps you talk about identifying systemic risk. I think on slide 5 you talked about risk exposures, transition channel, and then that determines potential impact. But when you actually look at the steps, when you start working through them, at one point you talk about counterpart exposure, but in the identification steps, again, we totally agree with liquidity. We think there's been a lot of work done at the FSB and IASCO on that front. I think a lot of that's applicable to the insurance industry as well in terms of, ultimately an activities-based approach should be consistent across all sectors of the financial industry. So with appropriate differences for business models, of course. But at one point you start talking about macroeconomic exposure, and that's there where we probably have the most questions. Are still thinking it through. Again, from the perspective of trying to identify what makes a risk systemic or not, I do think it's appropriate. Almost everything you talk about in the macroeconomic exposure area is, worthy of talking about. The Financial Stability Board has a macroprudential surveillance group that is constantly in your sort of day jobs. You spend a lot of time looking at those issues, so that makes sense. You should be talking about those. But some people from risk departments are here. They spend a lot of their regular business addressing those risks. But what makes them systemic, at least from our perspective, it's either the liquidity asset liquidation channel or the counterpart exposure channel. And so I've two boys are in high school now. They're dealing with algebra. So if I make an analogy with algebra, I think you've got the formula right, but some of the variables might need to be adjusted. If you put is like step 0, all the macroprudential surveillance that you're always doing, and all the regulators are always looking at, could be low interest rate environment, it could be 20 years ago people were worried about the high interest rate environment. So those things are always changing, and the risk departments are dealing with hundreds of risks really. Which ones get determined to be systemic, we think has to go through that's a transition channel lens. And so we're worried that macroeconomic exposure, to the extent it talks about linkages, which is just another way of talking about counterpart exposure. We think that makes sense. But if you mix in the vulnerabilities with the actual measurement of what makes it systemic, that makes the analysis a little bit more difficult. And maybe just as an example of that, in the money market mutual fund industry in the United States, that there are some serious problems there. And that was largely an asset liquidation one. But there's also a counterpart exposure element to that when, one fund broke the buck. Everyone just, not everyone. The retail people didn't move, but the institutional side did because they were focused on counterpart exposure. So we think that's another good example. Probably the best example is derivatives. And that's one area what I was going to talk about in terms of recognizing other previous steps. Obviously, the IAIS should be included, but I would also include in your analysis what steps the FSB has taken, in derivatives. Again, it's an example of how, the number one source of counterpart exposure in the 2008 crisis was derivatives. And their solution wasn't it was an activities-based one. Anyone involved in derivatives now have to central clear, minimum collateral requirements, very strict standards on haircuts based on the quality of the collateral, et cetera. That was, in my mind, the first activities-based approach response to the crisis. And so it's in my mind, it's a good example of how you can appropriately address counterpart exposure through an activities-based approach. And that's probably, it leads to my last concern. There's some, and it's not clear in the paper, but one could read that paper and think, the IMF has done a lot of work on tsunami versus domino theory. We at least our belief is that, a well-designed activities-based approach can address both those risks. And again, but I think that require consideration of counterpart exposure as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Just one point I wanted to react. Obviously, any policy measure could not necessarily be a policy measure that is addressed to the companies in order to mitigate the exposure. Could also address to supervisors that could carry out a certain macroprudential surveillance activity. We will include also policy measure that has, to be included in what is already in the ICP 24. And the other point is that, maybe we should explain better what we mean for macro economic exposure, but this is actually the same concept we explained in the NTNI paper with regard to, for example, the indicator on variable annuities. The fact that you can have a very high an exposure which is highly correlated with the market, and and in case of stress in the market, could stress also the balance sheet of the companies. But this would be interesting to know your comments on that.
Yes, I completely agree with you. A lot of these things can be addressed through and it's fortuitous. You're also reviewing a lot of the ICPs right now. I can just we're thinking of one ourselves in ICP 15 when it talks about investment. We were actually sort of surprised. There's some language about it, but I think there needs to be more language about diversification of investments. It's just that, you talk to any CIO or CRO, they're constantly focused on that issue, and so I think that would again, it's best practice. I think most firms do it, but it's good to have it in the ICPs. But maybe this probably helps me illustrate my point about counterparty exposure. Whenever you come up with the potential policy measures, the next step would be to ask, okay, how does this address systemic risk? You can very clearly measure that with respect to asset liquidation and counterparty exposure. Let's say, again, for something that's already been done, the derivatives reforms, you can show how that lowers counterparty exposure by having the collateral. If you come up with a policy measure, how does it address asset liquidation? It's clear. How would it address macroeconomic exposure? It doesn't help you understand where that's, at least in our view, any policy measure to address systemic risk, you should be able to tie it back to the transition channels. And it's not clear how macroeconomic would do that, but it is very clear, from the Asian financial crisis, if you look back at all the crises, you can actually measure it through those two channels.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Galina van dem Hagen. I were a head of capital in my previous remarks. Now I wear my head of global treasurer of Manulife. So I could not applaud more the direction on ABA and in particular the focus on liquidity risk. So as much as I would tell Paulo not so fast, I would tell Alberto go, because I am quite concerned for us as the industry with what I would call a moral hazard risk due to the fact that liquidity risk is not addressed in a much more structured manner for internationally active insurance groups. We all manage it. I just think that given the environment and given the fact that we are all, from our perspective, using derivatives to hedge our risks. So we are big derivatives players from the hedging perspective. We are exposed actually to rising interest rates, which is not the unthinkable given the current environment. And what happens in that situation is we will be called to post collateral, and given the movement to central clearing, we will be called to post cash, to be specific. And when I talk to banks, and I talk to them regularly, due to the banking regulations, actually they would all agree, and this was voiced by the CEOs of banks, we think the system is much more vulnerable than before the crisis. They would all, like one of my colleagues, summarized it to me, say, from the banking side, summarized by saying, we all individually hold more capital, we all individually hold more liquidity, but it is not there for you. So the system is much weaker, I think. We know on the repo side that the market has been decimated in the last few years in terms of activity. It takes a relationship pool to even post treasuries. There was a study done a few years ago by a major U.S. bank that showed that it takes 1/10 of treasury volumes to move the price now relative to the pre-crisis years, and it's not even clear whether the market will be there, like haircuts or no haircuts. And we are talking government. It has nothing to do with the perception of risk. It's just how the regulation works. The banks are withdrawing from making the market. So I'm very concerned about this. And what I would strongly encourage IAIS to do as almost a priority is to do in conjunction with BIS and the asset managers to run actually cross-sectoral liquidity stress test to see how different players behave and what they think they would do in response of the crisis. So then you could see jointly how much we are assuming we will put on the market in terms of government paper, of AAA's paper, etc., and will the market really be there for us to absorb it, or will it be ultimately the call on central banks and really for no particular sort of credit-specific reason other than the system design also that sort of discourages the provision of liquidity. Thank you very much. On the process side, I'm a bit disappointed. I have to say that it's February 1st, so I would also encourage that those dates are communicated much more in advance, because I think you will have a commitment from the treasurer's side to participate actively in those discussions as they manage liquidity risk as their mandate.
I'm aware of that.
I think one thing to push on that point is, we're available, to have, if you want to meet during the regularly scheduled meetings of the group. I mean, we're having meetings, every 6 weeks, and I would encourage you, if you want to have participations, I mean, maybe not a 54-page slide deck, but some type of potential information would be helpful.
Okay. Ralph Blanchard, Travelers, as someone who hopefully is not going to be affected by this. That's my hope. That's my expectation, if it's working right. But with the talk about cross-sectoral, we've had discussions at the IAA about how different sectors of the financial industries use the same terms and are talking over each other because they all have implicit assumptions. When you talk liquidity risk, on the property casualty side, you're talking like months. And on the banking side, you're talking hours or days. So the concern I have is that when you be careful about the cross-sectoral things, because there's a lot of implicit assumptions out there. The banking folks assume that whenever a storm hits, we have to pay the cash the next day. Well, the reality is there's no bank to go cash a check even if you did write a check that next day, because that's what catastrophes do. So again, just a caution, it looks like everything's making sense. One other observation is that strongly support the idea of looking at risk mitigating factors. I just know that sometimes the risk mitigating strategy is not sustainable in a crisis. So just you're probably already aware of that.
We should know that as a supervisor. Yeah. Thank you. And sure. As I said, we are looking at the inconsistencies, but I said unjustified inconsistencies. So we will see whether the specificity of insurance is, requiring a different approach.
As Ralph alluded, the IA is looking at this, and we'll have some comments to share. My question has more to do with maybe what might be missing from the way the project was defined, and so it really has to do with non-regulated firms. So if I think the business model of insurance is it aggregates risk in a diversified manner. So banks do maturity transformation, we do risk aggregation. So for example, assume some change in the market. In other words, you're focused on macroeconomic issues, but what if it's a non-macroeconomic issue? It's a change in the business model of how risk might be done. So if I see in the next 5 years a business model that says, come join our club. We are a risk management club for the rest of your life. We're not an insurance company, You buy a share in this company, and we'll charge you, if you will, traditional rates, but you're going to get dividended back because you're going to give us all your data, and you are going to be an active risk manager, and you're going to become part of a very select pool of people. So the market will see great risks gravitating away, and insurance as an industry would be left with bad risks. So that seems to me like a systemic issue, but it's not one that would be caught in this net. So is that kind of feedback helpful in kind of identifying those kinds of things?
I think they are, but even though I think it would be difficult to tackle this type of issues, but certainly, because the non-regulated companies are non-regulated. And
the larger question too in there is also what's the impact of regulation itself? I mean, even a few people today alluded to, well, if you get the wrong regulation, it kind of, sinks the Titanic. So,
for this reason, we are looking also at any other situation that could create correlated responses from the industry. This could be changing in the regulation, or could be many.
Yeah, and I was just kind of brainstorming out loud a little. Those are the kinds of questions we were trying to think through in your 4 steps, like that initial screening. What might you miss? What are some other things? So we'll have some things to contribute on that.
Julian Adams, Prudential PLC. Look, I think we broadly support and welcome the activities-based approach. I think it's a good step forward. I just want to make 4 sort of cautions, though. One is we do see it very much as a replacement rather than supplemental, and I think being clearer, quicker about that might even help the development of an activities-based approach. I want to reinforce the point that Joe made around, I think, tsunami and domino risk can actually, in my view, I think it's wrong to regard it as a kind of bipolar. One is dealt with in one framework, another in another framework. I think you can actually design it so that it's an activities-based approach, covers both. I want to underline the last point, which is I have a reasonably strongly held conviction that insurance companies, if they stick to the knitting, are not systemic. I think microprudential regulation can make it. Poorly designed microprudential regulation can make insurance companies systemic. So it induces or can induce pro-cyclicality, and we've seen that in the UK in pre-Solvency in Solvency 1, pre-Solvency 2. It's one of the criticisms that a number of people have about the design of the risk margin. It can actually heighten pro-cyclicality. So I think looking at and I think one of the cross checks that you can do in this, Alberto, is you can look at how the ICS is being developed to at least to ensure that it doesn't act in a pro-cyclical way. Otherwise, all you're doing with your activities approach could be made redundant. I'm also cautious about cross-sectoral consistency for the reason that was given earlier. I mean, I think what I'm strongly supportive of is designing a stress that is then applied throughout the financial economy, and to actually observe how different agents behave. And I think there'd be a lot, if you have across Basel, IOSCO, IAIS working group, I think something that tried to do that would actually be jolly interesting. And my last point is, it's interesting when you both read the paper and you listen to the debate as we've heard it today. It's all framed in terms of agents and actions. One of the groups that we don't reference very often is policyholders, and they themselves can act in a way they're incentivized in a way very often not to behave pro-cyclically. And sometimes when you consider the tsunami kind of risk, I think you also have to look carefully at revealed policyholder behavior over cycles. And I think you can't simultaneously both ding people for a capital add-on for the guarantee given and assume that the guarantee is going to lapse. So I think thinking more carefully about how policyholders, as well as insurance companies as a kind of monolithic block, behave in crisis would be worthwhile. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Actually, as I said, pro-cyclicality is part of our, analysis, and this is one of the actually one of the example where you can have an impact of the market because of certain measures that are applied. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve Brody from PCI.
I knew you had also a slide, but okay.
Well,
so we have it.
I'm going to be very brief. We are collecting comments from members, and we'll definitely have more to say in the near future. But we welcome the development of the activities-based approach. I particularly want to endorse the comments that Joe made regarding transmission channels, and that Julian has just made regarding our feeling that once the ABA is sufficiently built out, that the IAIS should seriously consider replacing the entity-based approach with it. We've felt that the U.S. should have engaged in an activities-based approach, as the response to the financial crisis, as opposed to the approach taken in Dodd-Frank. So this has been something that we've been interested in, if it's done properly, for a long time. So we look forward to continuing to work with you on this very important project.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah. Mac.
Thank you. Makoto Kubo, Nippon Life Insurance Company. So for the ABA activity-based approach, we have not yet concluded our analysis, so it's quite premature to share our perspective on the specific questions. But for more generally, if you look at the liquidity risk or maybe systemic risk and all that, I would recommend you to see the differences that exist in different sectors, different market, different type of contracts, the different behavior that you can expect from the customers, different type of contracts. So those would have a very different perspective. So sometimes, what you're observing in one area would be counterintuitive for other areas. So again, the philosophy from the Taoism says that in order to achieve something, you have to start from something opposite. So if you want consistency, start looking at diversity. And it seems to me that you want my advice where to go in this city, right? So before this meeting, I was together with a Japanese colleague, and I found a museum. It's about the very famous singer from this town, whose name is Johnny Cash. And you can buy T-shirts which says cash, cash, and cash. It may be a good souvenir if you're interested in liquidity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mac.
Thanks, Alberto. Hugh Francis of Aviva. I'd just make three quick comments, echoing many that Joe and Julian made as well. I think overall, the key point from our perspective, we very much welcome the direction of travel on the ABA and think that it's really a good starting point. And I think actually some of the comments you're seeing are probably a function of where you've got, and it's very helpful that you've shared them early, but clearly there are aspects that we very much welcome, such as the four-step approach, the idea of looking at assets and liabilities holistically, looking at risk mitigation and looking at net rather than gross. And so those aspects we very much welcome, including that looking at the existing micro policies, because we do see an interaction there. So there's a lot very much to commend the initial thinking. As with others, we're still looking at some of the detail on that. I think some of the function may be where you are in the process, because when you're hearing concerns, we very much recognise liquidity, but when you're coming into areas like macro, because you haven't really defined it in enough area, there's a certain amount of nervousness about where that could lead in terms of policy measures, because really you need to get to the transmission mechanism. So you've developed the concepts, but until you are a little bit more tangible of which the direction of thinking that you're going, that will give us more comfort, because in one way it could go in a sensible direction, clearly liquidity, risk management, some of those are important areas to go, but the more that you keep it at a higher level, I think the more that you'll get it from us. Well, I can't quite see the linkage, where are you going exactly on the macro, because you can see counterparty. So I think that maybe what we'll want to do is work with you more closely, because I think some of those will be resolved as you've refined your thinking and you put it down in paper. But, very much commend, and we're looking forward to engaging.
Thank you. Actually, I've been always thinking that when presenting the policy measure would make all the picture clearer, certainly.
Jeff Alton from CNA. So I'd like to pick up on a little bit of what Hugh said. I mean, we're still working our way through this. We appreciate the opportunity for dialogue. Not being a GSI, I think we're not as far along in the learning curve of systemic activities. But one of the things that I think we and a lot of other companies are concerned about is the new definition. Because from our perspective, everything in the ABA starts with the definition of systemic. Because that's what's going to then determine what activities end up in this evaluation. And so one thing that we do find lacking in the definition, and we'll give them to in our written comments and we're working with others, is that an identification of a trigger is not in there of what triggers an event to be systemic. And what I mean by that is, in the old world, right, which made sense to me, we would always bring up AIG and financial products and say, as a result of what happened at AIG, we're doing all this, we've got systemic and we have the FSOC. And so from my perspective, AIG was a non-performance issue. So it's whether you perform on a contract, a very legal contract, and in their example, they were unable to put forward collateral when they called upon, so it was a non-performance issue on their part. This new definition that you've introduced specifically removes insolvency, which, so conceptually from my mind, we've moved away from, you could be in something where you perform on a contract that's a legal contract with a third party, but it still could potentially be systemic. And that's conceptually is what we're having a hard time getting our heads around. I mean, from our perspective, and I know I hear Joe talk eloquently about transmission channels, from our perspective, that is, there needs to be a hierarchy in this definition. The first hierarchy needs to include what the trigger is. Is it performance or is it non-performance? So, and when I hear you talk about prosecular and I hear other people talk about prosecular, from my perspective, that's performance-based. I've got a legal contract that I legally can enter into with a third party. All securities laws allow me to do that, and now you're saying that is systemic, which from our perspective seems a little bit unusual, especially since the only reason we would do the activity, because we plan on holding the security till maturity, right, to have a duration match, is because of the ICS. And so this is, and I know it was brought up earlier by Julian, I mean, this is that kind of disconnect that appears to be going on here. I mean, I appreciate the dialogue. I become smarter on the topic every time I talk about it, and I talk to others about it, so I think you guys are heading the right direction. I don't want to say you're not heading the right direction, but from my perspective, it appears that we may be starting in, chapter 30, and I'd like to start in chapter 1. And that chapter 1 includes what is the trigger. And if an insurer enters into a contract and meets the obligations of that contract, can that still be systemic? And that needs to be answered, and it needs to be in that definition before we start developing all these framework around to stop something from happening. We need to know what that something is.
I see your point. Actually, this was an issue that has been highly discussed among us. It is challenging, however, because the trigger, you cannot make a trigger based on a single company. The trigger would be an aggregated trigger that in an ABA concept. So it's quite challenging and to say when an activity carried out by the single company becomes systemic. For this reason, we do not say that an activity is systemic or not systemic, but it is potentially systemic. Then you have to see what is whether this exposure or activity is widespread in the market, which is the level of the aggregated exposure, which is.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. It's very complicated. But without doing that, I would argue the credibility of this exercise would come in doubt. And I'm not here to criticize, but it would come into doubt because you would move into this being very subjective and arbitrary, right? So Helena laid out some very articulate reasons why liquidity. And I'm with liquidity, but again, that's performance-based. It's performance-based. And so having those basic understanding, and that's why when when we used to talk about when we talked about the tsunami effect in Windsor and and the insolvencies, from my perspective, that was very clean cut. Even though I disagreed with it, very clean cut from the standpoint that you would have insolvencies. That's the trigger, is the insolvencies. That's now been removed, and so I just think we need to have that identification, that clarity, so then we can move forward.
Now I put myself in a difficult position. Jeff's one of our members. Joe's one of our members. Julian was one of our members. I just wanted to come up here primarily to thank you for the opportunity to have these conversations. Thank you for setting up the meeting in London at the beginning of next month. I mean, this is sort of evidence of a good process for taking input at various stages and working through this together. I think that in our initial assessment of the approach you're taking, the focus on the gaps, looking through existing measures, trying to fully understand the risks that you're focusing on is an important part of the process, very responsible part of the process. And then the last thing, I guess, is to agree. I guess Julian brought up a point which we're wrestling with, which is, how do we make sure that also in the conversation around the ICS that we don't sort of introduce procyclicality into this, that then becomes part of the systemic risk conversation. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Brian Piquel, Prudential Financial. I just want to take the time to thank you for the efforts you've made so far. It's obvious you've put a lot of thought into this. So we support the direction of the document and the approach. I do want to agree with Joe and with Julian on the sort of bipolar relationship between tsunami and domino effect. We fundamentally believe that you can deal with both together, and would really caution you in terms of when you think about policy measures, don't overcomplicate the issue. I think the gap analysis is critically important to the end result of this project. Take time, focus on the gap analysis, really, really look for best practices in microprudential regulation, and also begin to look into the companies for best practices in risk management, et cetera, governance, critically important. Look at yourselves as standard setters when you think about the policy measures. Find those best practices, use them as global standards, and apply them across the activities globally. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Any other? I think in any case it was very useful for us. I'm hesitant to summarize all the inputs now, but I think this is what I expected, to be honest, because all those aspects have been actually discussed quite heavily in our group. I don't know. Stephen, want to?
I just would echo Alberto's comments on, these are a lot of very difficult issues. These issues we've been wrestling for a while at Treasury with, and particularly I think the issues around macroeconomic exposure. I think to the extent you have detailed feedback there, I think that would be most important, I think, for us, frankly. The liquidity risk section, I think we feel like there's a broader kind of consensus on that being a topic of work going forward. So I just would sort of, when you're thinking of where to focus your energy, I think the comments raised there, I would sort of encourage you to give us feedback there.
Yeah, and I would add that I'm conscious that we have an occasion now, as the insurance sector, as the IAIS, to build something which is tailored on insurance sector, that takes into account in an holistic approach all the policy measures. So we don't have a lot of time, but we are committed really together with you to build something which is suitable. I don't know. So at this stage, I thank you all. I thank you, the IAIS, also to making it possible, and have a nice evening. And see you 1st of February.